From the outside, Anjette Lyles seemed to be a real-life Mildred Pierce. She owned and operated her own restaurant in Macon, Georgia, where she always made sure her patrons' bellies were full and put smiles on their faces. To most that knew her, she was a beautiful, sassy, prominent community figure. It took a long time for Macon to understand what was really going on with Anjette Lyles. Anjette was the only child born to Jetta Watkins and William Donovan, who ran a successful produce business together. Anjette came along in 1925 and learned the family business as she grew. She picked up a great many skills she would use in her future career as a restaurateur. Anjette married into her career. Ben F. Lyles Jr. inherited Lyles Restaurant, the restaurant founded by his father, who had recently passed. The two operated Lyles, with Ben in the back keeping books and Anjette in the front charming customers. Her personality and beauty made Lyles a popular destination in Macon. Anjette and Ben married in 1947 and welcomed children in 1948 and 1951. After the birth of their second daughter, Ben's health began to fail. He had struggled with rheumatic fever since his time in the military, but his symptoms worsened as time went on. Ben abruptly sold Lyles without consulting his wife, Anjette. His symptoms only got worse after that. Ben F. Lyles passed away in January of 1952. Medical examiners struggled to decide on a cause of death. Encephalitis was the cause written on the death certificate. Anjette found herself a single mother with 2 children, with no business or way of generating income. She and her daughters moved in with her parents, and with their support, Anjette was able to get a job in a local restaurant and actually save the money she was earning. She vowed she was going to buy back Lyles, and in 1955, she did. She, of course, renamed the restaurant Anjette's. Anjette's became a daily destination for some Macon residents. It turned into a local hotspot, and people were always around, whether they were hungry or not. People loved her demeanor, and even more, they were inspired by her ability to bounce back from tragedy. Anjette Lyles was one of the most popular women in town. Some of the food at Anjette's was so popular you can still find recipes for several of their dishes. But people also loved coming in just to socialize. Many men came in just for the pleasure of flirting with Anjette, and with her big personality, she was always happy to oblige. After dating several men around town, Anjette remarried. Her new husband was a pilot for Capital Airways, Joe Neil Gabbert. The marriage was a surprise to many because they eloped in New Mexico on a weekend away. Joe moved in with Anjette, her parents, and 2 daughters. Not much is known about Joe's relationship with Anjette, but that's probably because the marriage only lasted 4 months. By that point, Joe was permanently living in a veterans hospital with an unexplained rash covering most of his body. Anjette legally had her name changed back to Lyles after Joe's death. She didn't go back to her maiden name of Donovan, but rather back to the name of her first husband. After receiving a large life insurance payout from the policy she held on Joe, Anjette started making extravagant purchases. Neighbors began to raise eyebrows after she purchased a new house and car, and started dating without what some thought was an appropriate period of mourning. She began dating Joe's co-worker at Capital Airways, which many found in poor taste. Julia Lyles, Ben's mother and grandmother to Anjette's daughters, moved into the new house with the family. This way she got to spend time with her granddaughters every single day. She saw it as a blessing, until her health began to deteriorate. Julia had previously been helping Anjette with some restaurant chores, and the two became close. During this time, Anjette stumbled upon proof that Julia was wealthier than she knew, and realized that her daughters stood to inherit a large estate when their grandmother passed. Anjette tried, unsuccessfully, to get her mother-in-law to create a will, leaving all of her wealth to Anjette. Julia died in 1957, and Anjette immediately produced a document she claimed was Julia's will. There's differing information on who obtained the wealth. I've heard that most of it went to Anjette, but I've also read accounts that the funds were split evenly between Julia's son and Anjette's daughters. Either way, Anjette obtained a great deal of money after her mother-in-law passed. Julia Lyles was buried beside her husband and son, and after Anjette received her inheritance, neighbors saw her driving around in a shiny new convertible. It's hard to believe that nobody was catching on at this point. How did people not see that death and misfortune seemed to follow Anjette wherever she went? Why couldn't people tell that she was the person creating these situations, and not one of the innocent victims? When Anjette's eldest daughter, Marcia, died, the people of Macon couldn't take it anymore. Marcia actually fell ill while she was at the restaurant. Anjette's employees begged her to take Marcia home. The child was dead several weeks later, after Anjette sat with her every day at Parkview Hospital. Public suspicion was out of control. After an autopsy, it became obvious that the child had died of arsenic poisoning. Marcia Lyles was only 9 years old. Shockingly, Anjette tried to place the blame on Marcia's younger sister, Carla. She took the child to law enforcement, where she had the child tell an obviously phony story about how she and her sister were playing hospital one day, and even gave each other medication. Anjette showed them the bottle of medicine. It was ant poison. This bizarre attempt to explain the presence of arsenic flipped a switch for authorities. They immediately ordered the exhumation of the bodies of Ben Lyles, Joe Gabbert, and Julia Lyles. Upon further medical examination, it was determined that all three had been killed with arsenic. It's difficult to understand why medical personnel had such a hard time diagnosing these poisonings at the hospital. According to some sources, Julia Lyles' hands swelled up like balloons in the hospital. They were useless. Nurses had to hold glasses of water with straws in front of her face because Julia couldn't hold anything. Why didn't the hospital notice these as symptoms of arsenic poisoning? Why were they so baffled by Joe Gabbert's rash? Why didn't anyone become suspicious that with each of these deaths, Anjette was always at the bedside of the person whose health was deteriorating? When Marcia was in the hospital, she kept improving, then deteriorating, then improving, then deteriorating. This baffled doctors. Anjette was probably changing the amount of arsenic she was giving the child all the time in an attempt to confuse doctors. But it only made them suspicious. I don't know if she ever would have been caught if she hadn't killed Marcia, but the child's death was so unnatural, they couldn't help but investigate. After word broke about Anjette's poisoning, the city was buzzing for weeks. This woman, whom they loved and respected, and who fed them things they happily consumed, had been killing her loved ones. Many became afraid that they'd been poisoned at the restaurant. Anjette was arrested on 4 counts of murder on May 6, 1958. She was ill at Parkview Hospital at the time. Some have suggested with self-inflicted arsenic poisoning. Anjette's trial was a media circus. Paparazzi waited outside to snap photos of the beautiful, silver-haired murderer. Word got out that candles, written spells, and herbs were found in Anjette's bedroom. The media took this and hopped on the occult panic train, and if you watch some other videos on the case, you'll see that many of them are still aboard. Anjette was sentenced to death in October of that year, a decision that didn't sit well with Georgia politicians. They conceded that certainly she was a monster, but they wanted no part in the execution of a white woman in the state of Georgia. She received help with her appeals, but they still failed in all the higher courts. Eventually, the governor personally appointed a psychiatrist to examine Anjette. He declared her mentally unfit, and her sentence was immediately commuted to rehabilitation in a mental health facility. She died at the age of 52 in the Georgia State Hospital for the Insane. The cause of death was natural, heart failure. Material wealth was Anjette's primary motive. She received a large insurance payout for both of her husbands. Julia's death came with a large inheritance. She even had a life insurance policy on Marcia. She stood to profit off each of their deaths. It's heartbreaking that it could be so simple, that greed could drive a woman to kill not only adults, but her own daughter. She didn't try to hide the wealth she came into. She was always extravagant, always done up, and always showing off her affluence. That is all for today. If you're interested in additional cases involving serial poisonings, I'm going to have some videos linked in the description box. If you're interested in fiction, particularly fiction revolving around mid-century female restaurateurs, I recommend Mildred Pierce. I recommend the book, the Joan Crawford film, and the miniseries. It doesn't involve serial poisoning, but it is a very interesting story. I'll see you next time on Out of the Past.